I am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. Well, this week, Bolivia had a coup that didn't succeed, which raises questions about the role of the military in Latin America. And I have Dr. Christopher Sabatini from Chatham House. He's a senior researcher on Latin America with me to try to make sense of what happened in Bolivia. Hi, Doctor. Welcome to National Security News.
Thank you, Linda. Pleasure to be here again.
So tell us, what's happening there? You know, there's some reports it might not have been a coup.
We don't know. We may never know. But let's just try to speculate here, given what we know. First of all, the president, Luis Arce, had dismissed the army chief, Zuniga, for saying that the previous president and the current president, Luis Arace's mentor, Evo Morales, shouldn't be allowed to run for a fifth term of office. And for that, Luis Arce sacked the army director. But then a few days later, about less than a week later, he staged this coup. But the coup looks, first of all, it looks very old school. If you look at the pictures, you can find them online. There's a military vehicle trying to ram down the gates of the presidential palace in a rather desultory manner, quite frankly. And then the general comes out and he talks to the president. The president berates him, basically shakes his finger at him, and then he stands down. All just makes it look, first of all, anachronistic. Like, no coups like that don't occur anymore. And I hope we get to the issue of sort of where the military is more generally in Latin America, but also in Bolivia. But second, the timing was curious for two reasons. First of all, the president is in this battle with the former president, Evo Morales. Both are the same party, the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism. And who will run for president, because the presidential elections next year, who is the best inheritor, if you will, of the Movement Towards Socialism. So he's been engaged in this battle. In fact, the MAS, the party's legislators have been sitting out key votes just to protest this current president. Mm-hmm. So he needed some popularity, he needs some boost against his mentor. But at the same time, the Organization of American States, like the African Union, the multilateral body of the Americas, was meeting in Asunción, Paraguay, and they very quickly denounced the coup and stated their support for Arce. So it looked very convenient. It certainly was, whether or not it was intended. But it looked very convenient because it shored up his popularity. People poured into the streets. He stood down against this general, stood up to this general, who then stood down. And now he's kind of has a little bit of a honeymoon because he supposedly thwarted a coup.
So is it an intra-party fight, do you think?
I suspect, there are people who disagree. I mean, there's a lot of issues here, but certainly the cause is an inter-party fight, as you say. Basically, between Morales and Arce, and in fact, Zuniga, the man who attempted the coup, basically was saying that the MAS is not good for the country. So even if it wasn't orchestrated by the current president as a sort of, if you will, a fabricated auto coup, it at least was clearly a sign of rejection of the MAS and what this internecine battle within the dominant MAS party means for the country.
So how should the West and the United States view this?
Despite perhaps our suspicions, I think it did the right thing. It did come out and condemn the coup. All of the foreign ministers that were gathered in Asunción, Paraguay for the Organization of American States General Assembly meeting all declared the coup as illegitimate and reinforced their commitment to democracy. I think irrespective of who is behind it or whatever may happen, that's an important signal. Having said that, I mean, these sorts of coups of this, with army marches to the presidential palace, ask for him to resign, really are very much a thing of the past. There are other democratic problems in the hemisphere. For example, the creeping control of the military in places like Mexico or Bolivia, in which they're assuming greater control over the economy, in which they're assuming greater control over police. Those are concerns. So, it's good that we had this reminder of the coups of the past and that they were rejected. And I should say, if you will, Bolivia is the coup capital. If there's such a unfortunate designation of Latin America. There have been over 190 coup attempts. in Peru, in Bolivia rather, in its since its independence 200 years ago.
So tell us more about the role of the military in Latin American countries. If it's not old-style coup, like you call this one, what role are they playing?
It's a very good question. The truth is, with a few exceptions, Argentina being one of them, in which the military, and after basically creating an economic chaos and then invading the Falkland Islands, sort of left the presidency in shame. In most countries in Latin America, the military remains still a very popular, respected institution within Latin America. So, for example, in Mexico, under AMLO, the leftist, populist, autocratic president, he's given more and more control to the military over things like oil production, airports, ports, customs. He even dissolved an incipient attempt to develop a national police force and pass those responsibilities onto the military. In cases like that and others where the military, for example, in Ecuador, is assuming greater roles, a greater role in security, but also has always had a larger role in the economy. In places like, for example, Peru, where the military can serve at times as a broker between competing political factions, their institutional role, their economic role, and their political role is on the ascendant. And that's never good. It's never good because, first of all, they're not elected and they're not accountable. They often have their own institutional incentives and interests. But it's also bad because, especially in the economy, it's difficult to claw them back. When you put the military, as they did in Mexico, under AMLO in control of the airports and customs, which is a huge moneymaker for whoever controls it, you basically give them an offline budget that's outside the control of civilians. So that's always worrying. I'll just say, I was talking to a friend, won't indicate who, but he's an expert on the region. To his mind, what's happened in Mexico under AMLO, and now the baton will pass to his handpicked successor, effectively Claudia Sheinbaum, October 1st. He thinks that's the most troubling case right now in Latin America, precisely because of this dominant role that the military has.
So what impact would this have on the region?
I would say there's two impacts. Again, I want to emphasize that it's inspiring, being a student of Latin America during the 80s and 90s, that people stood up so clearly and so unanimously denouncing this coup. I think that's very positive. We need to recognize that this is not the 1970s in which militaries can intervene with impunity. But the problem is those are the easy cases when it comes to pushing back on democracy. When militaries, literally in the case of Bolivia, march through the plaza, try to attempt to seize the president's palace. Those are the easy cases. The more difficult ones, and ones in which we're seeing much, much more division, and often along ideological lines, is over the erosion of democratic checks and balances. So to take the case of Bolivia, for example, you had the previous president, Evo Morales, was attempting to run for unconstitutional, determined by his own constitutional court, an unconstitutional fourth term. He was allowed to run because he had packed the Supreme, and then he established a referendum, and not a very democratic way to amend the Constitution. We all know that plebiscites are really, direct democracy is very, very risky. Just ask those who oppose the Brexit vote. But in this particular case, he has cheapened the judiciary. In fact, he allows for the popular, under his constitution, the popular election of judges. That has cheapened the rule of law in Bolivia. In other cases, for example, in the case of Peru, we had a socialist president, a left-leaning president, who attempted to dissolve the Congress. The Congress voted him out of office. Now, the Congress is no great shakes either in the case of Peru. They've impeached multiple presidents, sometimes on very slim charges of corruption. But in this case, because the president actually tried to dissolve the Congress and rule by decree, and the truth is, countries like, or the presidents like that of AMLO in Mexico, refused to accept this illegal dissolution of the Constitution by Castillo, and refuses to accept the successor government. So ideologically, this is playing out in ways that, whether you're left or the right, you should be willing to defend constitutional integrity and the integrity of checks and balances. Increasingly, that's simply not happening.
So what geopolitical risks are there at the moment associated with Latin America? We know some are part of the BRICS, so part of the China-Russian axis. So are there risks?
they're huge. They're huge risks. I don't want to overplay it, but it's it's easy to become, especially because nominally at least, Latin America remains democratic, of varying qualities, if you will, of those democratic regimes, and some that have clearly fallen out. Nicaragua under President Daniel Ortega, who returned Sandinista. Cuba, Venezuela are clearly not democratic by any stretch. But you have weakened democracies in other places. But what you also have are several things that you mentioned, Linda. The first of all is the issue of Russia and China. China is not always immediately a threat. The truth is China does want and seek natural resources. It will, in many cases, comply with local norms regarding environment, regarding labor, what have you. But when it can get away with it, quite frankly, it will engage in more exploitative types of investment and bending the norms of protection of labor rights and the like. So in cases like Ecuador and previous government Rafael Correa, in the case of Venezuela, certainly, they've invested in ways that really are quite troubling. The other issue is Russia. Now, Russia has a different interest. It doesn't have much weight to throw around in terms of economics, but it can basically throw gasoline on the fire of social discontent, which we're seeing. Now, I don't want to dismiss some of the social uprisings we've seen in places like Chile or places like Colombia or even in Haiti, but there are very good sources of intelligence that are telling us that Russian intelligence are actually helping to fund these things. So they're taking existing discontent and they're basically throwing gasoline on the fire, including even in the case of Haiti, the proliferation of gangs and the gangs' increasing control. Allegedly, and I was told this by a very good source, Russia is behind this. And this particular former ambassador told me it's no surprise that most of the gangs in Haiti that have seized the government and controlled 80% of Port-au-Prince are carrying Kalashnikovs. That, you don't buy those on an open market. So Russia is in this game to basically sow discord and chaos. There's another geopolitical risk here, which I alluded to just now, which is transnational crime. And we're seeing this in the case of Ecuador. And in this case, the risk isn't just of insecurity. And in fact, insecurity and fear of violence is one of the number one concerns of most Latin American citizens. The risk is also that some of these countries become narco states, that they become criminal states. And that's, in fact, for the current president of Ecuador, that's, in fact, what he's fighting. It looked like the criminal interests had deeply embedded themselves within the judiciary and within the prison system. In these cases, having basically criminal elements control the apparatus of the state and have access to resources, a large part, not just obviously narcotics, although, we have to understand in the case of Ecuador, a large part of its security problems are being driven by cocaine that's being exported actually to Europe and the UK. So that, there's a complicity here among people who take drugs, but there's also a vested interest on the part of Europeans and Brits, not just Americans, to deal with this issue. But the fact that these countries can become, in the case of Venezuela, have become narcotic states, criminal enterprises, should be deeply troubling and goes beyond, again, just even security, but it goes beyond just issues of what sort of staging area these countries can be used for other nefarious activities.
So what is the role of the military in some of these cases?
What's interesting is the military is, in some cases, as it gets drawn more and more into policing, as it has in Mexico or as it has in Ecuador, actually becomes part of the problem. They, in fact, themselves become corrupted. They're seen and brought into policing because they're seen as being somewhat pristine, hierarchical, more professional. But in fact, they too can be corrupted, as we've seen. We've seen it also in Honduras. We've seen it in Guatemala. But in places like Venezuela, the military basically is the criminal enterprises. For example, in Venezuela, a country of about 28 million people, it has more generals per capita than the United States. The reason isn't because those are very good, capable strategists and military intellectuals. It's because they're basically, the government is selling positions to generals and hierarchies, including ex-military officers, to basically allow them to make money out of the illegal narcotics trade, particularly coming from Colombia through now passing through Venezuela. And that's very troubling. How you root out this level of corruption, this level of illicit behavior in an institution which is supposed to be, in many cases, has been the state, or a professional independent actor in the state, is going to be a deeply troubling issue for certainly the short term, hopefully not the long term.
So if we look like a case like Bolivia, if somebody in the West or America, United States specifically asks, well, why does it matter to us? What would you say?
It's a good question. I have to answer this question all the time, and I think about it. I've devoted my life to Latin America, so I have to justify my professional decision somehow. I think there are a number of issues at a really basic level, and this is perhaps it may not be the most strategic. It's the issue of immigration. 7.7 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. Okay. Bolivia, Ecuadorians are now fleeing in droves because of the insecurity problem. Guatemalans, Nicaraguans. The lack of democracy in a place like Nicaragua, or the lack of economic opportunity, or the insecurity in places like Ecuador are driving immigration. And now we're seeing the very ugly, polluting effect it has on U.S. politics. And I'm saying this, the concern isn't so much the poor immigrants who are fleeing dire situations. I'm saying this because it creates really very ugly politics, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and the UK. That's the first issue why we should care. The second issue is because this is about insecurity. The claims by people like former President Donald Trump that immigrants bring crime isn't true. But having said that, it does create connections that can lead to more transnational crime. And we're seeing this, for example, with the fentanyl trade, the opioid trade, that is crossing the border, that's killing literally hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. That is an issue. And the last issue is because while Henry Kissinger once famously said about Chile, he said, Chile is a dagger aimed at the heart of Antarctica. He was joking, of course, and he meant that basically Chile isn't of geostrategic interest to the United States necessarily. But the fact is that if it becomes a theater in which U.S. enemies, if you will, or those trying to remake the global order can gain a foothold, it is actually very threatening. And again, not just to the United States, but also to Europe and the UK, in part because also this is a bloc of 34 countries that if they aren't voting in favor of democracy and human rights, security, responsibly in places like the United Nations and elsewhere, it can actually undermine the West's imperfect, but let's be honest, successful liberal international system.